let's do a little ophthalmology while we're at it, unless someone else has any comments about that one. So from a historical point of view, you know, we talk about endothelial keratoplasty, and it didn't start out as DSEK or as DMEK. And actually the first indication, or the first idea to try and do endothelial keratoplasty was actually came about by this guy, Dr. Tippett, in the 50s. And he actually published a paper, and I've got pictures of the diagrams that he published. I think it was in the AJO, of him doing exactly that, doing endothelial keratoplasty. I had no knowledge of it when I was a fellow. Nobody really talked about it, and it seemed like an impossibility. And I remember one of the fellows went to a conference and heard Gerrit Mellis speak. I was talking about doing this procedure called DLEK, and I thought, no, that's not going to work. It's just, it's you know, not possible. But Mellis, you know, when he did it, he went out to California. He was a fellow. I think he might have been pre-residency. He was a pre-residency fellow working with Perry Binder out in La Jolla, California, and came up with the idea of splitting the cornea, taking out the inner lamella, and then replacing the inner lamella. So I heard him speak in, I think, 2001, and it was like a light bulb went off. You know, I just thought that this really changes the way we're going to do things in the future. So I signed up for his course, which was canceled that year because of hoof and mouth disease. They had an outbreak in Europe, so they couldn't get bovine eyes. So I went the following year and learned his technique. And this is a video. You can see there's 3 dissectors, you know, the red one, which I use a lot.
Are you sharing?
Oh, sorry.
No, you're not. Okay.
Well, let me share that. Okay. Okay, so you can see the video now, right?
Yep.
So there are 3 dissectors. There's the red one, which I like a lot, and we use that often for DLEK rescue. And then there's the silver one, which has a nice curvature to it and a nice rounded tip. And these were meant to be single use, or you know, use only 2 or 3 times. But you can use them many, many times. And then the third dissector has a blue handle. And the only difference between the silver and the blue is that the blue has a longer extension on it. And the idea is that you dissect from limbus to limbus at about 80% of the depth of the cornea. And you can see that this is quite an edematous cornea that we're working on. In fact, there's it's so edematous and chronically so that there's blood vessels there. And so you make a shallow cut about 50% of the depth of the cornea, and then you start the dissection with the red dissector, and then you carry it on from limbus to limbus, trying to stay in that same plane of dissection. And what I discovered is that I don't know if I discovered this, but one observation that I made is that when you're doing lamellar dissection, it's not a forceful maneuver. You hardly even fixate the eye. What the idea is trying to allow that dissector to find the plane of, you define the plane of dissection and then allow the dissector to continue it back and forth. And the more you push or the harder you force it, the less likely you are to separate the layers of plywood. Cornea is like plywood, where you've got all of these multiple lamella stuck together. And what you're just trying to do is to slip that dissector in there and use the back and forth motion of your dissector to separate the lamella, rather than trying to force it or using a sharp blade. That's why when we do these lamellar dissections, you don't really need a sharp blade. In fact, it's not optimal, because a sharp blade will go from one layer to the next, whereas if your dissector is slightly blunted, it will tend to separate rather than dive in and out of the different lamella. And I liken it to doing phaco. When you're doing your initial groove, what does it tell you if the lens moves when you're doing your phaco?
Pushing too much.
You're pushing too much, right? So it's either the lens is firmer than you thought, or you're not using enough power, or you're going too fast. So you can compensate for that by either making your groove a little more shallow. So it's kind of like scooping hard ice cream. If the harder the ice cream is, the thinner the layers that you're scraping off the top. And so it's a similar concept when you're doing lamellar dissection in the cornea, is that you want to let the dissector do the work rather than you forcing it. I just want to back up a bit, because I want to see if I'm actually holding the eye while I do it. And there is a rectus suture here that gives you a little bit of counter traction, but you could see I was just using the dissector, and that sort of protects you from using too much pressure. And then the next step of the procedure was to use these curved scissors. You make a mark on the external surface of the cornea, and there were 3 sets of scissors that were progressively more curved, so that you could cut it out. And what you can notice here is that how much the cloudiness of the cornea is actually from the posterior lamella. And once you take that out, the cornea is actually fairly clear. And now once you've done that, you have to go to a donor eye, which you mount on an artificial chamber. And I used to use a diamond knife to make a groove of about 400 microns. And then you have to do the same dissection on the donor. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why the procedure didn't take off and become immensely popular, is that it's hard enough to do the dissection once. And if you have to do it twice, it can be quite tiring and quite time consuming. So you dissect it completely, and then you'd punch it through just as you would with DSEK. And now you've got 2 hand dissected planes. You've got the first hand dissection plane on the recipient, and now you've got the hand dissection plane on the donor. And it's placed here on a spatula. And I used a Sheets glide to begin with. It's a much larger incision than you need for DMEK. And there's many different ways to do it. This way works quite nicely, to just sort of slip it in over top of a Sheets glide, and then remove the Sheets glide and gently unfold it, very similar to what you would do with a desect graft. Let's just see here. Yeah, so this is the preparation of the donor. And it's that movement of the dissectors, because you're just trying to get it to slip in between the lamella, and then you can end up with quite a smooth system. And in fact, before we went to DSEK, I did manual DSEK, and we actually had a little study. We compared DLEK to DSEK to DSEK, and we showed that there was a we had 4 groups. We had PKP, and then DLEK, DSEK, DSEK. And we showed that there was a continual improvement both in vision and in recovery time. So I ended up doing about 70 DLEK, and we published the complications, and we had got a few publications out of it. And it was actually pretty good. But then someone had the bright idea. I think Mark Gorovoy is credited with it, or Mark Terry got a lot of credit for DLEK. In fact, I remember being a visiting speaker once out in California, and the cornea staff there didn't know who Gerrit Mellis was, and he thought that DLEK was a procedure that was invented by Mark Terry. And I thought that was, I thought that was so sad, really, because Gerrit did all the work, and he actually didn't call it DLEK, he called it PLK, posterior lamellar keratoplasty, after the original inventor of the procedure back in 1955, if you can believe it. And in that book that I showed you, the book, the Barricare book, he's actually got pictures that show a similar procedure where they would make a lamellar flap with a keratome and then take the flap off or reflect it, and then tree-fine the rest of the way through, and then just transplant the posterior lamella and suture it in place with the, say, 4 sutures, and then put the flap back down and suture it down with the running stitch. So these were not new ideas. They existed in the literature, and it just so happens that Gerrit Mellis he's such a smart guy, and he just thinks outside of the box, and he just didn't take no for an answer. He just saw that there must be a better way to do this, and rather than accepting what he was taught, which is what I did and what most people, I think, in my generation did as well, he thought that there's got to be a better way to do it. And it didn't take him until he was 3/4 of the way through his career to think of it. He was already thinking of this beforehand. So that's why I have a lot of respect for, one of the reasons why I have a lot of respect for him. And it got me excited about doing endothelial keratoplasty, which I did it this way from 2002 till 2006, then switched to DSEK. And the reason, we actually had a patient who, he still comes to see us, actually, Mike Hucko, yeah. So he'd had a corneal ulcer, and he was very grateful for the treatment he got from us. And he asked if there was something that we could do. And I said, we're trying to get some money to buy a microkeratome, which at the time was about $60,000. then went up, as soon as it became popular, it went up to about 110,000, by the way. But he helped, he raised the money. He put on a dinner, invited all of his best friends, and he raised the money for us to buy a microkeratome. But it took 2 months to get in medical engineering to okay it, that we could use it. And medical engineering and nursing. I mean, it was just like mind-boggling. But they had to have the cleaning instructions that were created by the company, and they had to develop all kinds of protocols because the pure protocols for sterilizing in Europe were very different than here. So in the meantime, rather than waiting for DSEK, we did about 16 cases of DSEK, and we're getting very good results. Now, relatively speaking, not results like we're getting today, but you know, it was quite good. Now, Gerrit Mellis, Gerrit is, by the way, spelled with a G. I guess in Dutch, the G has a ch sound. But, so his name's actually Gerrit Mellis. But he's a composer. He composes classical music. So the guy's got interests like unbelievable. But he never went to DSEK. He very rarely does a DSEK procedure. He went straight from DLEK to DMEK. And in fact, when I was there in 2002, he was very circumspect. You know, he didn't talk a lot about it because I think he was worried that somebody was going to steal his idea, which probably somebody would have. But he was already working on DMEK. And when I went back in 2012 to take the course, that was the year I did a sabbatical. And my plan was to learn how to do DMEK and start doing it when I came back from sabbatical. So I went back to Rotterdam in 2012. And I kept saying to him, like I said, asking like, okay, well, where's your data from DSEK to show us that this is actually better than DSEK? And he kept saying, well, I don't have any. I didn't do any DSEK or DSEK, so you know, I have no data to compare it to. So he went straight. He made this huge leap, in my opinion, going from DLEK to DMEK, realizing that it wasn't necessary to remove the posterior stroma. And the only time I can, you know, I thought at one point that there would be cases like this one that you're seeing here. Can you see this very edematous cornea? Is it showing up on your screen? I thought perhaps in cases like this, where the stroma is incredibly thick, that maybe it would be worthwhile to debulk the posterior stroma. Because it's not doing any good anyhow. It contributes very little to the biomechanical strength of the cornea. Most of that comes from the anterior half of the cornea, and the lamella are much more solidly packed. So my thought is that perhaps in very edematous cornea, you're better off doing a DLEK and debulking the posterior part of the cornea so that new endothelial disc or stroma and endothelial disc that you put in there has less work to do. It is not having to deturgess an entire 1.5 millimeters of corneal edema, but you know, you thin it down to 0.7 or something like that, or 0.5 even. And I think that happened in some of the cases that we did, that, you know, we got a very thin donor and a very thick dissection on the recipient, and ended up with fairly good vision with DLEK and patients like this one here. So that's I like to talk about the history. They always say you have to know how you got to where you are in order to go forward. But I also like to give you some perspective of the people that have been involved in the field. So when you see these guys, we're really lucky to be standing with them and be part of the EK revolution. I mean, it's really been like unbelievable. I was getting pretty bored with penetrating keratoplasty, and the lamellar stuff just totally, it's kept me going for the last 20 years, really. So any questions about this? It's 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
But
Is it like
sorry, Giselle, go ahead.
No.
No, I have a dumb question, so you should go next.
they're
No,
not
I was just wondering if you that's also the dissection you do is like the same one you would do for adult if you want to do only manual?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you do a DLEK the way Gerrit Mellis recommends, yes, that's
Yes.
the way you do it.
That's the same one.
Yeah, but it's not easy because you're trying to get as close to Dua's layer as you can without penetrating. So it's not an easy procedure to do. Plus, you're having to dissect limbus to limbus because the next part of doing a DLEK this way
Would be trephinating on top.
Right. You fill the pocket with viscoelastic and then you trephine. So if you do that, if you dissect limbus to limbus, you're just increasing your chances. I think if you do the pi r squared and figure out what the difference in the radius between an 8 millimeter circle and a 12 millimeter circle, it's a huge amount. If you penetrate, so your chance of success is much less, and plus the predictability of how deep you are is harder. I'll show you some slides next time of showing that mirror effect that Mellis talks about to give you an idea of how deeply you're dissecting. But yeah, that's exactly how you would do it. And when I came back from Holland, I was so fixated on EK that I just considered DLEK was kind of a useful side effect of learning how to do EK. Because when I went to Mellis the first time, he said, well, start practicing on all your keratoconus patients, do a dissection on them. And if you're successful, then you'll do a DLEK. And so it was only later that I started to realize that DLEK in itself is a very, very important procedure, and equally as important because we're treating people that are very young with keratoconus and scars and stuff. So anyhow, I hope you enjoy the little bit of rambling and reminiscence. I don't think you get that stuff out of the textbooks.